Welcome back to Jersey Matters. I'm Larry Menti. If you take a baby aspirin every day to prevent heart attack or stroke, the United States Preventative Services Task Force says you may want to rethink that decision. We get the latest now from Dr. Brett Sealove, cardiologist at Hackensack Meridian Health. Hi, doctor. Thanks for your time. I wanted to talk to you about aspirin. I think there's a lot of people out there that are still taking baby aspirins every day to avoid a heart attack or stroke. And now they're being told that may not be a good idea. Where is this coming from?
Yeah, it gets conflicting, right? And over the last few days, aspirin has been this little dirty word. It used to be this game changer, and now it has this little negative connotation to it. So let me just put it into context if I can. Essentially, the task force is a 16-member volunteer group of physicians that orchestrate all the data and come to a consensus to our population for their health recommendations. So 5 years ago, they essentially said that if you're over 50 and have some risks, you should consider being on aspirin. If you're over 60, it's a discussion with your physician. And what happened over the last 5 years, there's this onslaught of data that aspirin has some risks, and those risks are pertain to bleeding in your brain, bleeding in your stomach, not just nuanced bleeding. And they seem to mitigate the benefit of aspirin. And that's really where we're at right now, that discussion has to really change regarding the benefit of aspirin versus the risk of bleeding. The new recommendations talk about if you're 60 and above, the benefit essentially is off-weighed by that risk of bleeding. And if you're between 40 and 59 and you have risks for heart disease, diabetes, etc., again, one should have a discussion with their physician. This doesn't talk about people that are on aspirin due to prior stroke, prior heart attack, etc. This is people that are new to the drug to prevent heart disease and stroke.
The bleeding that you're talking about, does that just come on? Is that just caused by the aspirin, or is it brought on by a fall or something else?
Yeah, the bleeding that the task force is referring to is actually typically internal bleeding. And that is a spontaneous event that happens naturally. And that risk increases with age. And that is the reason why the new recommendation is that if you're over 60, it seems to be that benefit of aspirin is outweighed by the risk of bleeding. If you're younger, between the ages of 40 and 59, the risk of bleeding is less. And that's why the discussion is more intimate with your physician about the risk versus benefit. But the older we get in life, the higher that risk of internal bleeding exists.
So if somebody's taking an aspirin every day right now, they should stop?
Yeah, it's a great question, Larry. To be honest with you, my phones have been off the hook because of that, question. The answer that I give people is do not stop any medication unless it's under supervision. There may be a reason why your physician has you on aspirin that's not part of the task force guidelines. Maybe it doesn't have to do with your heart risk. Maybe you had a prior mini stroke, blood clots, etc. So that discussion should happen on an individualized basis. Again, this is a general consensus for the population that if you're on aspirin, it deserves a phone call to your physician should you stay on it. If you are on it for, again, prior stroke, prior heart attack, prior stent, the answer is unequivocally you should continue it.
Is aspirin dangerous for the rest of us? I mean, it seems like such a safe drug.
Yeah, the lifetime risk of aspirin really takes shape based on the data about bleeding. So if you took an aspirin for pain, for example, for your knee pain and whatnot, it's a higher dose of aspirin. We're talking about an 81 milligram tablet of aspirin. And over time, it can irritate the stomach lining and even increase the risk of bleeding in the brain. So aspirin in and of itself on an as-needed basis is probably not too harmful for you, but cumulatively over years or decades, it can cause harm.
Are some of the other pain drugs safer than aspirin?
Regarding bleeding, yes. Some of the other medications that you're probably referring to, Motrin, Advil, Naproxen, those also increase your risk for bleeding. Okay. I guess what we talk about, this sheds light on a broader question I think you're alluding to, is that what we're putting in our body definitely has ramifications. Yes, there are benefits, but there are also potential risks. And the other thing I would tell you about this little thing called aspirin, it doesn't do anything to blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes. Those are the things, when you look at heart disease, almost 800,000 to 900,000 people have a new event a year. 80% of that or so is deemed preventable. Aspirin doesn't have that data behind it. It won't prevent 80% of heart attack or stroke. And it has risk, and those risks are real, and those risks are bleeding. So, I think the discussion when it comes to your physician about aspirin is, should I or should not be on this? And how do I really focus on preventing events? And the answer really isn't aspirin.
It's interesting because every answer you've given, you've talked about talking to your physician, do what your physician says you should do. So I guess that's the bottom line in all of this. If you're on aspirin or considering taking aspirin, you have to have a conversation with your physician.
Yeah, I think it's relatively quick, but I do believe that it's just the safest means of doing this, rather than taking this broad look about the population and interpreting that data to yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've been very informative, but you come away from this interview going, well, aspirin's a bad drug. I should stay away from that. There are some times you should be taking aspirin, right?
Oh, for sure. Again, aspirin is an oldie but a goodie, for sure. I mean, it has tremendous benefits. It is a mild blood thinner, so it decreases the risk of blood clots, which is the precursor for heart attack and stroke. So those people that are at highest risk and are under 60, we would really consider it based on a discussion about their risk of bleeding. So if you have low risk of bleeding but high risk for heart disease, diabetes, 55-year-old, etc., it's something that we still highly consider and is highly beneficial. The problem is the 75-year-old man or woman who has no known heart disease or stroke. The older you get, the higher that risk. The problem is we used to give it out like water until we realized that the risk of bleeding as you get older, that risk essentially matches the benefit of the drug. So yes, it is definitely a part of our armamentarium of medications. It's just not for everybody.
Wonderful. You've been extremely informative. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Anytime. Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Brett Sealove, cardiologist at Hackensack Meridian Health. Next on Jersey Matters, a South Jersey veteran needs a new kidney to stay alive. We'll talk with him next.